Jake woke to the sound of the warrior, working on something in the corner of the cave. The bioluminescent plants had brightened with the dawn and cast their colorful glow across the crystal walls. His leg felt much better after a full night of rest, and the alien gelling gel continued to work its magic on his injuries. He sat up on his sleeping mat and watched his unlikely companion as she bent over what looked like pieces of electronic equipment. She had removed panels from both his damaged radio and some kind of Vorthic communication device. Her 4 hands worked with incredible precision as she sorted through tiny components and circuits. 2 hands held delicate parts, while the other 2 wielded tools that seemed designed for the most intricate repairs. Jake was amazed by her skill and the way she could coordinate all 4 arms to work on different aspects of the same task simultaneously. When she noticed he was awake, the warrior looked up and made a soft greeting sound that Jake was beginning to recognize as her way of saying good morning. She held up a small crystal component and then pointed to his broken radio to show what she was trying to accomplish. Jake nodded to show he understood and watched in fascination as she continued her work. Over the next several hours, she managed to create a hybrid communication device that combined human and Vorthic technology in ways that should have been impossible. The finished product looked like nothing Jake had ever seen before, but when she activated it, the device produced sounds and images that both species could understand. It was a primitive translator that could convert basic concepts between their languages. The first word Jake learned in her language was her name. She pointed to herself and said, "Zara-Thik," in a voice that made the crystal walls resonate softly. Jake repeated the name as best he could as she made an approving sound. Then she pointed to him with a questioning expression. "Jake," he said, clearly, and she tried to copy the unfamiliar human sounds with her deeper voice. With the translator device, helping them communicate became much easier. Zara-Thik told him she had been living in this cave system for many months while conducting reconnaissance on Devourer activity in the region. Jake had never heard of the Devourers, but from her gestures and the translation device, he began to understand they were a 3rd species that posed a threat to both humans and Vorthic. She showed him tactical displays on Vorthic equipment that revealed the true scope of the Devourer presence in this part of the galaxy. These ancient aliens had been manipulating the war between humans and Vorthic for their own purposes by providing false intelligence and encouraging conflicts that weakened both species. While humans and Vorthic fought each other, the Devourers quietly harvested resources from the devastated worlds left behind. Jake felt his understanding of the war shift as Zara-Thik explained how the Devourers operated. They were master manipulators who stayed hidden while their enemies destroyed each other. The territorial disputes that had led to 3 separate conflicts between humans and Vorthic had all been orchestrated by Devourer agents working within both governments. What Jake had thought was a simple war over space and resources was actually an elaborate trap designed to weaken 2 species that might otherwise have been allies. The revelation was staggering, but it explained so many things that had never made sense about the ongoing conflict. Why peace negotiations always failed at the last moment. Why intelligence reports often contradicted each other. Why both sides seemed to know exactly where to strike for maximum damage. The Devourers had been feeding information to both militaries, ensuring that the war continued indefinitely. Zara-Thik showed him data about Devourer weaknesses and their hidden base locations. This intelligence could end the 3-way conflict and save countless lives on both sides. But she had been branded a traitor by her own people for refusing to kill Jake when she first found him. Vorthic military law demanded that all humans be eliminated on sight, and her act of mercy had made her an outcast from her own species. Jake learned that Zara-Thik had lost her children in a battle against the Devourers, not against human forces, as he had first assumed. Her mate had also died. in the same engagement along with most of her military unit. She was one of the few survivors who had discovered the truth about devourer manipulation, but when she tried to report her findings to Vorthik Command, they refused to believe her. The loss of her family had awakened something in Zarathik that her warrior culture did not easily accommodate. Female Vorthik were biologically programmed to protect and nurture the young of their species. When her own children died, those powerful instincts had no outlet until she found Jake wounded and helpless. Her decision to save him had been as much biological as emotional, driven by needs that went deeper than military training or species loyalty. Jake began to understand why she had risked everything to help him. In caring for his injuries and bringing him to safety, she was fulfilling a biological imperative that had been left empty by the death of her offspring. He represented the vulnerable young that her instincts demanded she protect, even though he belonged to an enemy species. As the days passed, Jake grew stronger under Zarathik's constant care. She adjusted the temperature of their cave to keep him comfortable and prepared, meals that provided exactly the nutrition his healing body needed. Her 4 arms allowed her to tend to multiple tasks simultaneously while maintaining constant vigilance over his recovery. She monitored his vital signs with Vorthik medical scanners and modified the healing treatments based on his progress. Jake also began to see the intelligence that military briefings had failed to mention about Vorthik females. Zarathik was not just a warrior, but a brilliant strategist and tactician who understood the larger patterns of the war better than most human generals. She had been studying devourer behavior for months and had developed detailed plans for striking at their hidden infrastructure. The hybrid communication device allowed them to share more complex ideas, and Jake found himself learning about Vorthik society in ways no human had ever experienced before. Their culture was far more sophisticated than human intelligence reports suggested, with complex social structures and philosophical traditions that valued honor and family bonds above personal glory. Zarathik explained that Vorthik males were bred primarily for frontline combat, while females served as the strategic planners and long-term thinkers of their civilization. This explained why she had been conducting solo reconnaissance missions that required months of patient observation and analysis. Male warriors would have attacked the devourer installations directly, but Zarathik understood the need to gather intelligence before striking. Jake shared what he knew about human military tactics and technology. Zarathik listened carefully as he described human strengths and weaknesses in space combat. She seemed particularly interested in human abilities to adapt quickly to changing circumstances and to work effectively in small independent units. These were traits that complemented Vorthik planning abilities and physical strength. Together, they began to develop a comprehensive picture of how the 3 species could work together against the devourer threat. Human adaptability combined with Vorthik's strength and strategic thinking could create a force that the ancient manipulators would not be able to counter. But first, the war between humans and Vorthik would have to end, and that would require both sides to accept intelligence from sources they had been taught to consider enemies. Jake realized that his rescue mission had become something far more important than just surviving on a hostile planet. He and Zarathik represented the first real communication between their species in decades. If they could find a way to get their information to the right people on both sides, it might be possible to expose the devourer manipulation and forge an alliance that could save both civilizations. But time was running short, and the challenges they faced seemed almost impossible to overcome. Jake stared at the massive hand extended toward him and felt his world shift on its axis. Everything he had been taught about the Vorthik told him this was impossible. Enemy warriors did not rescue wounded soldiers and offer medical aid. They certainly did not kneel down to seem less threatening or wait patiently for permission to help. But the evidence was right in front of him, in the form of a 12-foot alien female who had just saved his life. He reached out with his own much smaller hand and placed it in her palm. Her skin felt warm and slightly rough like leather that had been worn smooth by years of use. She closed her fingers gently around his hand, being careful not to crush his fragile human bones. Then she helped him stand up and tested his weight on the healing leg. Jake was amazed to find he could walk with only minor pain. The warrior gathered his few supplies and slung them over one of her shoulders as if they weighed nothing at all. Then she began to lead him across the crystal landscape, toward a destination only she knew. Jake limped along beside her, feeling like a child, walking with a giant parent. Every few steps she would look down to check on him and slow her pace if he was falling behind. They walked for what felt like hours through the maze of crystal formations. The alien warrior seemed to know exactly where she was going, even though Jake could see no path or landmarks to guide them. She moved with the confidence of someone who had traveled this route many times before. Occasionally, she would stop and listen carefully to sounds that Jake could not hear, then adjust their direction slightly. As they walked, Jake studied his unexpected companion more closely. Her 4 arms moved independently as she navigated the terrain, using her upper hands to push aside hanging crystal branches, while her lower hands maintained perfect balance. The natural armor plates on her body had scratches and dents that spoke of many battles survived, but her movements were fluid and graceful despite her massive size. When the twin suns reached their highest point in the purple sky, the warrior stopped at a small spring that bubbled up between 2 large crystals. She knelt down and cupped water in her hands, then offered it to Jake to drink. The water was cool and clean, with a slightly metallic taste that was not unpleasant. After he had drunk his fill, she took water for herself, using all 4 hands to scoop up larger amounts. Jake watched her drink and noticed something that surprised him. The way she held her head and the careful movements of her hands showed a delicacy that contradicted everything he thought he knew about Vorthic warriors. In the military briefings, they had been described as brutal savages who knew only violence and destruction. But this female showed a refinement and consideration that spoke of a complex culture. After their rest, they continued walking until they reached what looked like a solid wall of crystal that rose up into the purple sky. Jake could see no way around or over the barrier, but the warrior walked directly toward it without hesitation. When they were just a few feet away, she pressed her hand against a section of the wall that looked identical to every other part. To Jake's amazement, a hidden door swung open, revealing a passage that led into darkness. The warrior produced a small device that cast a soft blue light and led Jake into the tunnel. The passage was wide enough for her to walk upright, but Jake felt like he was entering a cave made for giants. The walls were smooth crystal that reflected their light in thousands of tiny sparkles. Their footsteps echoed softly in the enclosed space. After several minutes of walking through twisting passages, they emerged into a large cavern that took Jake's breath away. The ceiling stretched up into darkness, but the walls were covered with plants that glowed with their own inner light. Blues and greens and purples painted the crystal surfaces in patterns that shifted and moved like living artwork. The air was warm and humid with the smell of growing things. In the center of the cavern was a small living area that had clearly been set up for long-term occupation. There were sleeping mats made from woven plant fibers and storage containers carved from crystal. A small cooking area was arranged near a pool of fresh water that reflected the bioluminescent plants like a mirror full of stars. This was not a temporary camp, but a permanent home. The warrior gestured for Jake to sit on one of the mats while she began to unpack supplies from various containers. She moved around the space with the familiarity of someone who had lived here for a long time. Jake watched her work and began to understand that she was not just passing through this planet, but had made it her base of operations. She prepared a meal for both of them, using ingredients that Jake did not recognize, but smelled delicious. The food came in the form of small cubes that expanded when mixed with water to create a nutritious paste. It tasted better than Jake's emergency rations and seemed to provide more energy. As they ate, she watched him carefully to make sure he was getting enough food. Communication remained a challenge, but they began to make progress through gestures and simple drawings. The warrior used her finger to draw pictures in the sandy floor of the cave. She drew herself, and then drew Jake, showing how she had found him wounded and brought him to safety. Jake added his own drawings, showing his crashed ship and trying to explain how he had come to be on her planet. When Jake drew a picture of other humans, the warrior's expression changed to something that looked like sadness. She drew her own people, the Vorthok, and then made gestures that seemed to indicate fighting and death. Jake began to understand that she had lost someone important to her in the ongoing war between their species. The warrior then did something that surprised Jake even more than everything else that had happened. She reached into one of her storage containers and pulled out a small object that looked like a photograph. But instead of being printed on paper, it was somehow embedded in a piece of crystal that showed a three-dimensional image when held up to the light. The image showed two smaller Vorthok beings that were clearly young based on their size and unmarked armor. They had the same red eyes as the warrior, but their faces held an innocence that spoke of youth and inexperience. Jake realized he was looking at children, and from the way the warrior held the crystal, he understood they had been her children. She touched the image gently with one finger and made a soft sound that was clearly a name or term of endearment. Then she looked at Jake, and he saw pain in her glowing red eyes that transcended species barriers. Loss was loss whether you were human or Vorthok. The death of children hurt the same in any language. Jake reached out and gently touched her massive hand where it held the crystal image. She looked down at his small human fingers against her armored skin and made a sound that might have been gratitude. In that moment, they were not enemies from warring species, but simply two beings who understood what it meant to lose something precious. The warrior carefully put the crystal image away and began to prepare sleeping areas for both of them. She gave Jake the softer mat while taking the harder surface for herself. As the bioluminescent plants dimmed with the approach of night, she settled down to sleep using her upper arms as pillows, while keeping her lower arms free to reach weapons if needed. Jake lay on his mat, staring up at the dimly glowing ceiling and trying to process everything that had happened. 3 days ago, he had been a human soldier who knew exactly who his enemies were. Now he was sharing a meal and shelter with one of those enemies, and beginning to understand that the universe was far more complicated than military briefings had led him to believe. Outside the cave, the sounds of Kepler 442b's nighttime predators echoed across the crystal landscape. But inside their hidden sanctuary, Jake felt safer than he had since his ship crashed. The massive alien warrior, who should have been his death, had instead become his protector. As sleep finally claimed him, Jake's last thought was a question that would change everything he believed about war and enemies and the possibility of peace between different worlds. The Vorthok warrior leaped down from the crystal ridge with impossible grace for something so massive. Jake watched in frozen terror as the alien giant landed between him and the pack of razor-spine crawlers. The ground shook under the impact of her landing, and small rocks scattered in all directions. This close, Jake could see that the warrior was female, based on the broader hip structure and the way her armor plates curved differently than the males he had seen in military briefings. Moved like liquid death. Her lower two arms drew curved plasma blades that hummed with deadly energy, while her upper arms aimed wrist-mounted weapons at the approaching predators. The crawlers hesitated for just a moment, sensing a new and more dangerous threat. That moment was all she needed. The first crawler died before it could react. A plasma blade swept through its neck so fast that the creature's head was still trying to bite when it hit the ground. The second crawler leaped at her from the side but met an energy blast that turned it into smoking ash before it could land. The remaining 4 predators tried to surround her, but she spun in place with all 4 arms, moving in a deadly dance. Jake had never seen anything so terrifying and beautiful at the same time. The alien warrior fought with perfect coordination, using all 4 of her arms independently. She blocked one crawler's attack with a blade while firing at another and grabbing a third by the throat with her 4th hand. Her movements were smooth and practiced like she had done this dance of death 1,000 times before. In less than 30 seconds all, 6 razor-spine crawlers lay dead around her feet. The warrior stood perfectly still for a moment, scanning the area for more threats. Her red eyes swept across the crystal formations and then down to where Jake sat slumped against the rock wall. He tried to raise his weapon, but his hands were shaking too badly to aim properly. The massive alien turned to face him fully, and Jake got his first clear look at his enemy. She was even bigger than the intelligence reports had described, standing at least 12 feet tall, with broad shoulders and 4 powerful arms. Her skin was dark gray, with natural armor plates that covered her torso and limbs. The armor looked like it had grown from her body, rather than being worn over it. Her face was almost human in some ways, but alien in others. She had 2 eyes like his own, but they glowed with inner red light. Her mouth was wider than a human's, and when she opened it slightly, he could see teeth designed for tearing meat. But there was something else in her expression that Jake had not expected to see. Intelligence. Not the mindless aggression of a beast, but the calculating look of a thinking being. Jake waited for her to kill him. Every military briefing had made it clear that Vorthic warriors took no prisoners and showed no mercy to human soldiers. They were the enemy, and enemies destroyed each other without question. But she did not raise her weapons. Instead, she tilted her massive head to one side, like she was studying a puzzle she could not solve. The warrior took 1 step toward him, and Jake tried to scramble backward, but his broken leg sent lightning bolts of pain through his body. He gasped and almost dropped his sidearm. The sound seemed to affect the alien female in an unexpected way. Her glowing red eyes focused on his injured leg, and something changed in her expression. The cold calculation was replaced by something that looked almost like concern. She spoke in her own language, using a voice that was deeper than any human woman's, but somehow still feminine. The words meant nothing to Jake, but the tone was not threatening. If anything, she sounded like she was asking a question. When he did not respond, she tried again using different words. Jake shook his head to show he did not understand. The warrior seemed to consider this problem for a moment. Then she did something that shocked Jake to his core. She slowly lowered herself down until she was kneeling on the crystal ground. Even kneeling, she was still taller than Jake, but the gesture was clearly meant to make her seem less threatening. She placed all 4 of her hands palm down on the ground in what looked like a peaceful gesture. Jake kept his weapon pointed at her, but his finger was no longer on the trigger. This was not how he had been told Vorthic warriors behaved. They were supposed to be mindless killing machines that destroyed everything in their path. But this female was acting more like she was trying to help than hurt him. She pointed at his broken leg with one of her upper hands while making soft sounds that might have been questions. When Jake winced from the pain, she made a different sound. That was clearly sympathetic. Then she did something even more surprising. She began to remove items from a pack on her back, using her lower arms while keeping her upper arms visible and non-threatening. The first item she pulled out looked like a medical scanner of some kind. She held it up so Jake could see it clearly, then pointed at his leg again. When he nodded slightly, She activated the device, and a soft blue light played over his injured limb. The scanner made quiet beeping sounds as it worked, and the warrior studied a small display on the side. After scanning his leg, she put the device away and pulled out what looked like a tube of medical gel. Jake had seen similar products used by human field medics to treat wounds. She squeezed some of the gel onto one of her fingers and held it out for him to see. The substance glowed with a faint green light and smelled like something between flowers. And Medicine Jake was faced with an impossible choice. His leg was getting worse, and he had used up most of his own medical supplies. The pain medication was wearing off, and infection was a real danger in this alien environment. But accepting help from an enemy warrior went against everything he had been taught. What if the gel was poison? What if this was some kind of trap? The warrior seemed to understand his hesitation. She took a small amount of the gel and rubbed it on a scratch on her own arm to show it was safe. The wound closed almost immediately, leaving only unmarked skin behind. Then she held the tube out to him again with one hand, while keeping the other 3 hands flat on the ground. Jake's rational mind told him this had to be a trick, but his survival instincts were stronger. He was dying slowly on this hostile world, and she was offering help. Maybe it was better to die quickly from poison than slowly from infection and starvation. He lowered his weapon and nodded. The warrior moved very slowly and carefully as she approached his injured leg. Her massive hands were surprisingly gentle as she examined the makeshift bandage he had applied. She made soft clicking sounds that might have been disapproval at his crude first aid. Then, with movements as delicate as a surgeon, she began to apply the healing gel to his wounds. The effect was immediate and miraculous. The burning pain in his leg faded to a dull ache, and he could feel the broken bone beginning to knit itself back together. The cuts on his face stopped bleeding and started to close. Jake stared at the alien female in amazement as she continued to treat his injuries with the skill of a trained medic. When she was finished, the warrior sat back on her heels and watched him test his leg. Jake found he could move it without the sharp agony that had tormented him for days. The limb was still weak and sore, but the healing process had clearly begun. He looked up at his unexpected savior and managed to say the only word that seemed appropriate: "Thank you." The warrior tilted her head again at the unfamiliar sound, but seemed to understand the meaning. She made a soft rumbling sound that might have been acknowledgement. Then she stood up and began to pack her medical supplies away. But instead of leaving, she held out one of her massive hands to Jake, in what was clearly an invitation to come with her. Jake stared at the offered hand, knowing that his next choice would change everything. The warning lights on the control panel flashed red like angry eyes in the darkness of space. Lieutenant Jake Martinez gripped the steering controls as his small reconnaissance ship shook violently around him. The engine made terrible grinding, sounds that meant only one thing: complete system failure. He had maybe 3 minutes before the ship would fall from the sky like a dead bird. Jake pressed the emergency beacon button and spoke into his radio headset with a calm voice that hid his fear. "Command, this is Scout 7 reporting critical. Engine failure above planet Kepler 442b, requesting immediate assistance." Static answered him back. The radio was dead too. He was alone now and falling fast toward the purple-colored world below. The planet grew larger in his front window as gravity pulled his ship down like an invisible rope. Jake could see jagged crystal mountains that looked like broken glass and deep valleys filled with strange violet mist. This was not a friendly world. The intelligence reports had warned all pilots about the hostile environment and dangerous creatures that lived on the surface. But Jake had no choice now except to try and land without dying. He fought with the controls as the ship spun through the thin atmosphere. The heat shields glowed orange as friction burned against the hull. Jake felt sweat running down his face inside his helmet. The ground rushed up at him faster and faster. At the last second, he managed to level the ship out. But it was too late to slow down properly. The crash came like thunder. Metal screamed against rock as the ship bounced and slid across the crystal formations. Jake's body was thrown against his safety harness so hard that pain shot through his chest and left leg. The ship flipped once, then slammed down on its side, with a sound like the world breaking apart. Then everything went quiet except for the hiss of escaping air and the tick of cooling metal. Jake hung sideways in his pilot's seat, feeling like he had been hit by a truck. His left leg throbbed with sharp pain that made him dizzy. When he tried to move it, a wave of agony told him the bone was broken. Blood ran down his face from a cut on his forehead. Each breath hurt his ribs, where the harness had dug in during the crash. The emergency systems were still working, and red lights showed him what he already knew. Life support was failing, and the hull had cracks that let the outside air seep in. At least the atmosphere was breathable for humans, but that was the only good news. Jake managed to release his harness and fell heavily to what used to be the side wall of his ship. The pain in his leg made him cry out. Moving carefully, Jake gathered what supplies he could find. His medical kit was mostly intact with some pain medication and bandages. The emergency rations would last maybe 5 days if he was careful. Most important was the portable distress beacon that could signal for rescue if any human ships came within range. Jake wrapped his broken leg as best he could and took 2 pain pills that made the world seem less sharp around the edges. Getting out of the wrecked ship was like climbing through a metal cave. Jake had to squeeze through the torn airlock, dragging his supplies behind him. When he finally stood on the surface of Kepler 442b, the alien world stretched around him in all directions. The sky was pale purple, and 2 small suns cast strange double shadows across the landscape. Everything was tinted violet, including the air itself, which shimmered like heat waves. The crystal formations rose from the ground like frozen lightning. Some were clear as glass, while others glowed with inner light. Jake could hear sounds in the distance, clicks and growls that belonged to creatures he did not want to meet. His broken leg made walking almost impossible, but he had to get away from the crash site. Smoke and fire from his ship would attract attention from things that might be hungry. Jake found a shallow cave between 2 large crystals about 100 yards from his ship. It was not much shelter, but it would have to do. He set up the distress beacon and turned it on. The small device beeped once to show it was working and went silent. Now, all he could do was wait and hope that someone would hear his call for help before this hostile world killed him. The first night was the worst. Strange sounds echoed across the crystal landscape as alien creatures moved in the darkness. Jake could see glowing eyes watching him from the shadows between the formations. His leg hurt so badly that sleep was impossible. He took more pain medication and tried to stay alert. Whatever lived on this planet was out there in the dark, and he was helpless to defend himself properly. When the twin suns rose the next morning, Jake felt a little better. The medication had helped with the pain, and the daylight made the world seem less threatening. He used his small binoculars to scan the area around his cave. That was when he saw them, footprints in the sandy soil between the crystals. The prints were huge, at least 3 times the size of his own boots. They had been made by something with 4 feet that walked upright like a person, but much bigger. Jake's blood went cold as he realized what those prints meant. The intelligence briefings had described the Vorthic warriors, who sometimes patrolled this region of space. They were 12 feet tall with 4 arms and covered in natural armor that could stop most human weapons. Worse than that, they were enemies of humanity and had been fighting humans for years over territory disputes. If Vorthic warriors were on this planet, then Jake was in more danger than just wild animals and hostile environment. He tried to make his cave more hidden by piling rocks around the entrance. The work was exhausting with his broken leg, but fear gave him strength. Jake knew that if the Vorthik found him, they would kill him without hesitation. These alien warriors showed no mercy to human soldiers and had a reputation for brutal efficiency in combat. On the third day after the crash, Jake's worst fears came true. He was trying to gather water from a small pool near his cave when he heard the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. Jake grabbed his sidearm and hobbled back toward his hiding place as fast as his injured leg would allow. But he was too slow and too hurt to escape what was coming. The razor-spine crawlers appeared first. These native predators were about the size of large dogs, but covered in sharp spines and moved with deadly speed. There were 6 of them, and they had Jake surrounded before he could reach safety. Their eyes glowed yellow in the strange light, and saliva dripped from mouths full of needle teeth. Jake raised his weapon, knowing that he might kill 1 or 2 before the pack brought him down. The crawlers moved, closer step by step, like they were playing with their prey. Jake backed against a crystal formation with nowhere left to run. His broken leg screamed with pain, and sweat stung his eyes. This was how he was going to die, torn apart by alien predators on a world far from home. He steadied his aim and prepared to sell his life as dearly as possible. That was when the shadow fell across him. Something huge blocked out one of the suns, and Jake looked up to see a nightmare made real. A Vorthik warrior stood on the crystal ridge above him like a giant from legend. 12 feet of armored alien muscle with 4 powerful arms and weapons that could cut through steel. The creature's eyes glowed red in a face that belonged in humanity's darkest dreams. Jake knew his time had come. The grand throne room of the Veltar Empire was packed with thousands of officials, nobles, and citizens who had come to witness the conclusion of the marriage trials. Jake Morrison stood before Emperor Kethmorin's crystal throne, still wearing his spacesuit from the mission to help the Void Serpent. Beside him, General Vextar looked angry and defeated, his light patterns flashing with barely controlled rage. Princess Zarathiel stood near her father's throne, her own light patterns shifting through colors Jake had never seen before. He had learned enough about Veltar biology to recognize signs of deep thought and internal conflict in the way the lights moved under her skin. Hi. Advisor Melwyn stepped forward to announce the results of the trials. His ancient voice carried clearly through the massive chamber as he spoke in the formal Veltar language that Amy Carter translated for Jake and his team. Captain Jake Morrison of Earth has completed all 3 trials, Melwyn declared. He has shown courage in combat, wisdom in leadership, and sacrifice for the greater good. By the ancient laws of our people, he has proven himself worthy to request the hand of Princess Zarathiel in marriage. The crowd murmured with excitement and surprise. Many had expected the alien to fail, especially in competition with the renowned General Vextar. But Jake had succeeded through methods none of them had anticipated. Emperor Kethmorin rose from his throne, his imposing figure casting long shadows across the chamber. Captain Morrison, you have impressed my advisors and my people with your unusual approach to the challenges we set before you. You have shown that strength comes in many forms, and that wisdom can be more powerful than weapons. Jake bowed respectfully, as he had been taught, but his attention was focused on Princess Zarathiel. She stepped forward from her position beside the throne, and the entire chamber fell silent as everyone waited to hear her decision. Honored father, respected advisors, and gathered citizens of the Empire, she began, her voice clear and strong. I have watched Captain Morrison face these trials with interest and growing respect. He has shown qualities that our people value: courage, intelligence, and honor. She paused, and Jake could see her making a decision that would change both their lives. However, she continued, and Jake felt his heart sink, I cannot accept a marriage that began with accident and continued through ancient law rather than mutual choice and affection. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Several nobles looked shocked, and General Vextar's light patterns shifted to what Jake recognized as confused surprise. Princess Zarathil raised her hand for silence and continued speaking. But I have learned much about human concepts of partnership and equality during these past days. Captain Morrison has shown me that there are different ways to build alliances and share leadership. Therefore, I propose something unprecedented in our history. She turned to face her father directly. I request that we establish a formal alliance between our peoples, with Captain Morrison serving as Earth's permanent ambassador to our empire. This would allow us to continue working together as equals, learning from each other's strengths, while respecting both human and Veltar traditions. The chamber erupted in excited conversation as nobles and officials debated this unexpected proposal. Jake felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. He had grown to genuinely respect and care for the princess, but he understood her reasoning completely. Emperor Kethmorin studied his daughter for a long moment, then looked at Jake. Captain Morrison, what is your response to my daughter's proposal? Jake stepped forward, choosing his words carefully. Your Majesty, I am honored by Princess Zarathil's wisdom and her innovative solution to our situation. I accept the role of ambassador, and I believe this alliance will benefit both our peoples greatly. Before the emperor could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the palace. Palace guards rushed into the throne room, and urgent messages flashed on the communication displays around the chamber. Vextar had not accepted his defeat gracefully. While everyone's attention was focused on the marriage ceremony, he had gathered his most loyal military units and launched a coup attempt. Veltar warships loyal to the general were approaching the capital, and reports came in of fighting at key military installations across the planet. The general claims that the emperor has been corrupted by alien influence, reported the captain of the palace guard. He says he will restore traditional Veltar values and eliminate the human threat to our culture. Emperor Kethmorin's light patterns flashed with anger as he realized the scope of the betrayal. How many ships does he command? At least 40. Warships, Your Majesty, plus ground forces at 6 major military bases. Many soldiers are confused and following orders without understanding the full situation. Jake stepped forward without hesitation. Your Majesty, my ship and crew are at your disposal. We'll fight alongside your loyal forces. Princess Zarathil moved to the tactical displays that had been activated around the throne room. Her royal education had included military strategy, and she quickly began coordinating the defense of the capital. Father, we need to get you to the secure command center. Captain Morrison, can your people help us coordinate our response? The next few hours were intense and chaotic. Jake found himself working closely with Princess Zarathil in the palace's military command center, combining human tactical knowledge with Veltar technology and resources. Dr. Wong provided analysis of the enemy force dispositions, while Lieutenant Carter helped coordinate communications between loyal Veltar units. The space battle above Veltar Prime was unlike anything Jake had experienced. Veltar ships moved with fluid grace, their energy weapons creating brilliant displays of light against the star-filled sky. Jake's small human crew aboard the USS Liberty worked alongside Veltar captains, sharing targeting data and tactical information. Captain, I have an idea, Princess Zarathil said as they watched the battle displays. Many of General Vextar's soldiers are following him because they believe he represents traditional values. What if we could show them that cooperation between our peoples makes us stronger, not weaker? Jake understood her thinking immediately. You want to demonstrate human Veltar teamwork in action, so the soldiers can see the benefits for themselves. Working together, They developed a strategy that showcased the best of both species' capabilities. Human tactical flexibility combined with Veltar military strength proved highly effective. Ships that had been struggling against the rebels began winning decisive victories when they coordinated their efforts with human advisors. The turning point came when Jake made a crucial decision during the largest space battle. General Vextar's flagship was severely damaged and about to be destroyed by loyal forces. Jake could have allowed his rival to die, ending the threat permanently. Instead, he ordered rescue ships to save the general and his crew. This act of mercy was broadcast throughout the Veltar military communication networks. Soldiers who had been fighting for General Vextar began to understand that the humans were not conquerors seeking to destroy Veltar culture, but allies offering partnership and respect. Within hours, many rebel units began surrendering or switching sides. General Vextar himself was captured alive, and the coup attempt collapsed as more and more soldiers chose loyalty to the Emperor over the promise of military glory. In the aftermath of the failed rebellion, Emperor Kethmoran addressed his people from the palace balcony. The crowd below included Veltar citizens alongside Jake's human crew, all celebrating together. Today we have learned that strength comes not from isolation and tradition alone, but from the wisdom to accept new ideas and new friendships. Emperor declared, Captain Morrison and his people have proven themselves true allies of our empire. Princess Zarathiel stood beside her father, but her attention was focused on Jake. Over the past days, they had worked together as equals, sharing ideas and supporting each other through crisis. The partnership that had begun as an accidental marriage proposal had evolved into something much more meaningful. Later that evening, as the celebrations continued throughout the capital city, Jake and Princess Zarathiel walked together through the palace gardens. The alien plants glowed softly in the darkness, creating a peaceful atmosphere far removed from the chaos of the day's battles. Captain Morrison, the princess said, I want you to know that my decision about the marriage was not a rejection of you personally. I have come to respect and admire you greatly. Jake smiled, feeling more relaxed than he had in days. Your Highness, I understand completely, and I want you to know that I've come to feel the same way about you. Working together today showed me what real partnership can look like. She tilted her head in that curious gesture he had grown to appreciate. Perhaps in time, when we know each other better, and when any relationship between us would be based on choice rather than ancient law, we might explore those feelings further. Jake nodded, feeling hopeful about the future. I'd like that very much. And in the meantime, we have an entire alliance to build between our peoples. Princess Zarathiel laughed, a musical sound that reminded Jake of wind chimes. Yes, Ambassador Morrison, we certainly do. I have a feeling this is going to be the beginning of something extraordinary. As they continued walking through